Well, sorry about that. I was just hassled by a bunch of people. So, by 1936, Stalin had effectively created a very totalitarian state, as I said, that had never existed in the history of the world before. And, around that time, Germany was already under Hitler. So, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union made a secret treaty to basically say, oh, in the case that any one of us is in a war, they would not attack the other one. And eventually they made another treaty saying that if any of them attack Poland, the other one attack at the same time. And these were secret treaties. Nobody knew about these things. And by 1940, Stalin started a war in Finland to expand Russian territory. But that didn't work out at all because, as I said, Stalin had taken out all of the people who were already there inside the politics, inside the military, and replaced people that were loyal to him exclusively. And because of that, sometimes the people that were loyal to him were people that were not very good at their jobs. So the Soviet Union had catastrophic losses in the Winter War, it's called, in 1940. And eventually in 1941, when Operation Barbarossa started, when Nazi Germany attacked Russia, Stalin, didn't believe it. He thought that the Germans would never do a war on two fronts, that they would never have a war with both Britain on the west and the Soviet Union at the east at the same time. And because he couldn't believe that, the Soviet Union was actually very slow in mobilizing their forces to defend the motherland. So huge amounts of losses, especially material losses, were sustained at this time. So and the Germans advanced incredibly rapidly into the Soviet Union. And for a lot of for the Soviets, they had to take a lot of their industrial capacity around the Ural Mountains and even behind the Ural Mountains, so they could ensure that in the case that the Germans advanced really, really far deeper into Russia, they could still sustain military production. This is the hero cities where the major battles of World War II happened, at least in the Soviet Union. And eventually, you probably know a few battles that happened in the Soviet Union in World War II. There was a siege of Leningrad, which continued for a year, where people were starving and had no food in the end, but were finally relieved. There was Stalingrad, and Stalingrad was incredibly strategically important because it was the gateway to the Caucasus, which was the source of Russian oil. And without oil, you can't have tanks, you can't have planes. Your effectiveness is reduced dramatically. So, and of course there was Moscow. And in all of these places, eventually the Soviet Union was victorious, but had catastrophic losses. It's said that around over 20 million people died in the Soviet Union during World War II. 20 million, think about that. Yeah, so eventually the Soviets kept moving until they reached Berlin. And Stalin, while he was going to Berlin, he was telling everybody else that he was kind of liberating Berlin, but eventually, and in Eastern Europe as well, and Central Europe, but the Soviets actually took over everything. They annexed all of those places, and put puppet governments over there that were loyal to the Communist Party and the Soviet Union. And they garrisoned huge amounts of troops that were there. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't what they were saying, what they said was going to happen, but they did it anyway. And so, at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union had sustained catastrophic losses, but on the other hand, they had a huge military, they had incredible industrial capacity, and Stalin had basically made Russia the largest it had ever been in its history. And his reign continued for 8 more years. They developed nuclear weapons at that time as well. So the Soviet Union became even more deadly. And in 1953, one day, he just kind of died. Like, it was very sudden. And he died when he was, if I remember correctly, 75, 74-ish years old. And after he died, there was a power struggle in which a certain guy called Nikita Khrushchev, he won the power struggle. And Khrushchev eventually started a process called de-Stalinization, where he basically talked about all of the crimes that happened during Stalin's reign. And he said that Stalin wasn't, he was a great leader, sure, but he's not as great of a guy as we originally thought he was. And that was a shock to the entire Soviet people, because Stalin was so in control of the entire country that either people didn't know about it, or the people who knew about it, they were too afraid to talk about it. But even today, Stalin has a very complicated legacy, even with the process of de-Stalinization. And de-Stalinization wasn't just about Stalin's reputation, it was also about rehabilitating people that he persecuted. And right now, when I was walking at the Kremlin Wall necropolis, you see, different heads of the Soviet Union that are also interred there. So you see, for example, Brezhnev and Chernenko. And for those guys, they have maybe like 5-6 roses on their graves. But for Stalin, it was a mountain, like a hill of roses. Because people still today respect him very much here. As I said, even though he committed incredible crimes, incredible human rights violations, millions of people sent to prison, millions of people executed, but he also made the Soviet Union, one of the most powerful countries in the history of the world. And certainly, I personally think that Stalin was probably the most powerful person in the history of the world, because he was a guy who was completely in charge. Nobody dared resist him. And he was in charge of an incredibly powerful military, incredibly powerful industrial capacity, very large economy, huge amounts of land, and nuclear weapons. And of course, you can eventually say that America outstripped the Soviet Union later on in how much more powerful they became militarily. But American presidents don't come even close to the amount of control that Stalin had. So yeah, he was probably the most powerful person in the history of the world. And that's about it for this video. Sorry for that little mishap earlier. I was accosted in public by a Santa, and yeah, now I'm gonna go see a friend, and see you later.